Welcome everybody to GoLocal Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. Let's go right to our favorite political scientist, the chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Virginia, Jennifer Lawless. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, I'm happy to.
Okay, it doesn't get any more, we say it all the time, it can't get any more wild and woolly. Let's go to last Saturday night, Tulsa, Oklahoma. 19,000 people were expected to show up. More than 1 million tickets were reserved or sought after, and Donald Trump walked into an arena. It looked to me, having been on the Civic Center Authority back in the day, that was about a 10,000 people in that building, but far short of the 19,000 that he expected. What were the ramifications of that underachievement by the Trump campaign?
Well, I think that's exactly right, that it's an underachievement. In real life, for many candidates, if you were able to get 9,000 people into an arena for a rally several months before an election, that would generally be considered a success story and indicate enthusiasm behind a campaign. But because the Trump campaign oversold, and because rallies are such a pivotal part of his base and the way that they demonstrate their support for him, the underperformance really matters. I think first it suggests that even his voters who have been opposed to what they would consider draconian measures for shutting down the country seem to have been more reserved than we would expect about attending a rally with no masks indoors and jeopardizing themselves because they're in a state where the corona case numbers are going up. The other thing that I think is really striking is that the level of enthusiasm among those supporters in the venue, while high, was not what we're accustomed to seeing. I mean, if you watch that rally, it does not have the same level of excitement that the rallies in 2016 had. And so between the crowd size and the sort of, I wouldn't call it lukewarm enthusiasm, but less than stellar reception that the president received, I think it's probably giving a warning to the campaign.
He goes to Arizona, has a second rally in a super church, as they are called. I think it was about a 3,000, 4,000 seat arena. That was packed. That did seem more saw more enthusiasm. And in Arizona, the case increases in the number of coronavirus cases are off the charts. Number of hospitalizations are growing rapidly. Was that a little bit of a rebound for him, or was the fact that it was a smaller arena sort of say, okay, not a win, but not a loss?
I think the campaign can spin it as a little bit of a rebound. But the two things that strike me about the Phoenix rally are first, that the city of Phoenix actually has a mask law, and it did not apply to this rally. So the president came to a state where the numbers are now off the charts, where hospitals are approaching capacity, and he still had another indoor event with thousands of people who were not masked. And the second thing that I think is really important is that under normal circumstances, the president would visit a state under those conditions to deliver a message about a public health crisis, not about his own reelection prospects, and certainly not about bashing the Democrats or Congress. And so both of these opportunities for the Trump campaign, I think, could ultimately become opportunities for the Biden campaign to juxtapose the way that he's handling the crisis with the way that Donald Trump is. And now they have visuals and video for campaign ads to make that juxtaposition even clearer.
Okay, so we leave there, we go and we look at the numbers and the political ramifications from Florida, Texas, Arizona, Oklahoma, all pretty much red states. Florida, you could argue it's a purple state. And then, of course, California, where the number of cases, the number of hospitalizations are exploding. And the narrative really in the national media is that the lack of a federal program, a federal policy on combating the coronavirus is really undermining the efforts to control this coronavirus. Is that where we are right now, that he's now risking potentially some of the most critical states to his reelection?
I think so. And it's not even, to me anyway, a narrative. It's just the truth. If you look at the facts and if you look at which states have opened and how they've opened and whether they waited and followed the CDC guidelines for a 14-day decline in the number of hospitalizations and deaths and new cases, we see that the CDC guidelines actually seem to have been reasonable and sound and have resulted, at least as far as we know right now, in relatively successful reopenings. We see that in New England, we see it in New York and New Jersey and Connecticut. We're not seeing it anywhere else. Now, in some of these states, it's impossible for a Democrat to win. So I don't think that Trump has to worry about the spike in Arkansas or Alabama. It's almost impossible to envision any scenario whereby he loses those electoral votes. But in states like North Carolina and Florida, or even Texas, which is becoming increasingly competitive, he's now very vulnerable because his failed federal response is actually affecting people's lives. And it might be the case that in states like Florida and Texas and Oklahoma, people are going to have to, unfortunately, know people who contract the virus and who get very, very sick from it, or perhaps even die from it, before the level of concern appeals to them the same way that it has to people in the Northeast. And so, that's certainly not a silver lining. We wouldn't want that for anybody. But perhaps now that these states are being touched more directly by it, we'll see those governors wind up singing a different tune.
But Americans have amnesia over history, and at the rate of the news cycle nowadays, maybe it's better that it gets over in June and early July. Will folks even remember this come the dog days of the October election period?
Well, it's unclear that in those states it will be over by July or even early August, because those governors are not responding the way that the governors in the Northeast did when their numbers were off the charts. So in the Northeast, when the numbers were off the charts, the states shut down, and they shut down for a long time. And they reopened very, very slowly. Here, there's not one governor in any of these states that are experiencing significant surges willing to say that they're going to shut the state down to get this under control. And so we know what happens to the numbers, and we know how you can get it under control when you take the shutdown measures. We don't know how long this will last if we don't. But if you compare the United States cases to those of the European Union, we see nationally that we now have the same number of cases as we did in April. That's basically been the case across the last 3 months. And there's nothing to suggest that the states that are really experiencing major upticks are doing anything differently now than they were a month ago.
We do run the risk in the Northeast. We're not exactly closing our borders. There's plenty of flights coming in from Florida and Texas and Arizona of people, snowbirds, saying, let me get out of here and let me return to my home states. That potentially could fuel yet another rebound of cases here in the Northeast. So the complexity of being this amalgamation of 50 states may cause this virus to bounce around the country incessantly without a vaccine.
I think that's right. And without a federal response and without a set of federal guidelines, there's really nothing that the governors can do. Governors Cuomo, Murphy, and Lamont put into effect a 14-day quarantine for people coming from states that have seen this surge in cases. But that quarantine is basically self-enforcing, right? We're asking people to do the right thing and stay home until they're sure that they don't have the virus and that they're not transmitting it asymptomatically. And that will certainly help. It's better than not having it, but it's limited in what it can do. It's not like they're banning planes coming in. Apparently they have access to Port Authority records, but thinking that somebody is from a different state or knowing that they have a license plate in a different state is not sufficient grounds to pull them over. If you pull them over for something else, you can then start asking questions. But I think that there's limited efficacy to these measures as well.
Let's go to Tuesday's primaries. There were a number of upsets and a number of indications that parties are not dictating everything this year. The Democrats had, it looks like, a scare. The party had a scare in Kentucky in the Senate challenge to Mitch McConnell. They had recruited a female former Marine who looked on paper to be a great foe to the Senate Majority Leader. And then what happened? Out of nowhere comes a young black man who runs a very spirited primary campaign, spends, 1/12 of the amount of money, and is in, the total count's not in, but it is within shouting distance.
Yeah, there's a chance that he could defeat Amy McGrath, who's basically been running for this seat for 2 years, ever since she lost but had a very good showing in a Kentucky House race in 2018. Black Lives Matter matters. right? So the entire racial justice argument that has been taking place over the course of the last month propelled, I think, a lot of candidates who might not ordinarily have had as much a chance into fighting distance. It's not only in Kentucky, though. In New York, we've also got a situation where it looks like Eliot Engel will be defeated. He's a longtime incumbent with a very solid Democratic voting record. He was basically AOC'd, right? The same way that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez took out an incumbent last time around. We're seeing that this time. And there are other incumbents who are basically holding on and didn't even think that they had substantial challenges. Carolyn Maloney, for example, it looks like she's going to be able to declare victory, but there was a relatively conservative Democrat running against her on the Upper East Side in New York, and she didn't really pay attention. So I think we're learning that this notion that incumbents run scared has applied to general elections. I don't think they've realized that we're at a point in time now where it's the primaries that are really the competitive place for most of them, and they should probably be running scared there as well.
Yeah, I mean, that defeat for the Democrats of a sitting House chair with a long-standing liberal record, 20 years in the House, was not a surprise in the last week or so, but certainly if you had predicted that a month ago, people would have thought you had lost your political insights in the case of that race. Let's go to Joe Biden. How's Joe Biden doing? In the polling, he's up 10, 12, 9, 14 points, but it is June, not November.
Right. And Joe Biden has a challenge in front of him, which is to ensure that voters don't think that the outcome is a foregone conclusion. Because Hillary Clinton was polling substantially ahead of Donald Trump at this time in 2016, not with the same level of enthusiasm, not by the exact same margins. And Trump was certainly not as vulnerable on many key dimensions. But part of Clinton's problem was not only that people didn't like her, but many people who did felt like it doesn't matter if I turn out, she's got this one. There's no way that we can elect Donald Trump. And so what Biden has to ensure is that voters don't develop that sense of a foregone conclusion. It's tricky and challenging because we still do have a lot of time until November. And every week seems like it flies by, but also that 19 new things pop up. And making sure that Americans can remain enthusiastic and invested is very hard, especially given the current political context, the current public health context, and the fact that it's the summer and everyone's going stir crazy and can't do what they typically do.
And it's only going to get worse in the fall, in all likelihood. So if the summer is disrupted, the fall has a potential of being even more disrupted, especially if the so-called second wave hits.
One thing to add to that is, and this is out of self-interest, but I'm personally petrified, colleges and universities reopening in the fall, and so late August and early September, have the potential to be, their own second wave, separate and apart from what we're seeing. A lot of universities are working to ensure that students go home at Thanksgiving and don't come back, and that will help quell the spread. But we're still talking about basically lots of little cruise ships all across the country having students come and live on them. And frankly, although young people are great at a lot of things, social distancing and mask wearing doesn't seem to be among them.
No. I won't get into the college environment. We'll leave that aside. But in all likelihood, we're going to see outbreaks on college campuses reported within a week or two of colleges reopening if they open in vigor, as many of them have said they would. Let's also take a look at the VP race. It's been a little bit quiet in the last week or two. Val Demings has been in some high-profile Sunday morning shows. The others, Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, those are considered the three front runners, have been less in the public eye. Is there any insight into where this selection is going?
Well, we do know that in the last week, Amy Klobuchar took herself out of the running. And that was more significant, I think, for Elizabeth Warren than for anybody else. There was no way, after we saw what happened in Minneapolis, that Amy Klobuchar was going to be the nominee. But when she said that she was no longer interested in being considered, she went a step further and said that the time right now is one for a person of color to be vice president. And that basically puts the pressure on Elizabeth Warren to decide whether she wants to continue to be vetted and continue to be considered, or whether she too thinks that this is a time to step aside and say, you know what, the nation needs healing, the nation needs to address racial justice in a way that an all-white ticket can't do it. And she hasn't said anything yet, but I think that's been the major development here. Is Elizabeth Warren going to take herself out and make it easier for Joe Biden, or is he going to have to make a decision?
Joe Biden outraised Donald Trump in the month of May. Both rang up big numbers. The difference was only a few $1 million. Was that a surprise and a expression of Joe Biden's strength, or was that just catching up from earlier months in which he did not fundraise particularly well?
I think it has to do with the fact that he's now the official nominee of the party. I mean, waiting for the convention to, sign, seal, and deliver the news, but he's basically the nominee. And Democrats are ready to be on board. I think the Biden campaign probably breathes a huge sigh of relief, because in this economy, it was nice for them to see that people still have dollars and are willing to give them to presidential politics.
As always, you get the last word.
For me, what I'm really looking at this week is the way in which the Trump administration tries to do damage control over the testimony of Dr. Fauci and the other medical experts who testified before Congress on Tuesday. They've basically said that wearing masks is vital, that attending rallies is a disaster, that these numbers are continued to go up until there's a federal response. And the administration continues to say absolutely nothing. At some point, especially if Florida, Texas, and California continue to post the numbers that they're posting over the course of the next few days, I don't know how Donald Trump doesn't have a press conference to address these issues. And I'll be interested to see what he says. It's been a very long time since we've heard from him.
Professor Jennifer Lawless, thank you so much for joining us. For everyone else, we'll be back at 12 noon with Dr. Michael Fine, addressing some of the very issues Jennifer Lawless has raised on mask wearing and otherwise. Again, thank you so much for joining us, Professor. And everyone, please stay safe.